Hello and welcome to the official podcast of the Cleveland International Film Festival, CIFF Speaks, sponsored by Wayside Furniture. I'm Dee Perry, and I'm joined by my co-host and producer, Aaron Spears. And Aaron, one of the things I admire about this festival is its commitment to social justice and its demonstrations of how film can support the kinds of explorations and conversations that need to happen.
I totally agree, Dee, and that commitment is clearly shown through initiatives like the Groundbreaker Award. It was created to elevate and support filmmakers of color who educate audiences about structural racism and work towards racial equity through their films.
And Aaron, I'm so pleased to welcome to CIFF Speaks the winner of this year's Groundbreaker Award, Brooke Pepion Swaney, and the subject of her film, Daughter of a Lost Bird, Kendra Mylnechuk Potter.
So I wanted to start off, Brooke, with a question on something that you and Kendra had done previous to this film. You made a short narrative in 2012 called Okay, Breathe Orally. Though you didn't know it at first, that film mirrored Kendra's real-life experience of being a Native infant adopted by a white family. I was wondering, at what point did you two then begin the film journey that we see in Daughter of a Lost Bird?
Yes, this is a question that we actually get quite a bit, and I feel like I answer it differently every time. But, through getting close, through making that short film together and becoming friends, and knowing that Kendra was searching for her Indigenous identity and had a lot of questions and wanted to know. And, because like my identity as a Blackfeet and Salish person is so important, I thought, here I can help my friend, find out, where she comes from, whether that's making a film or just, being kind of beside her as a friend. And somewhere in that space of like a year or 2 years after we made the film, Kendra says it's me. I say it was maybe a little bit her. We decided to make this film together. And part of the reason that I was interested in making the film was also about, this contextualization of history in a personal story, or at least like giving some of the backdrop of history, because while Kendra and April weren't, direct products of the Indian Adoption Project, or, Kendra wasn't a part of the Indian Child Welfare Act specifically, certainly these things were at play in both of their lives.
And Kendra, the film opens with you making the first call after finding your birth mother, April, and getting her voicemail. And your face is, I felt like there were so many emotions colliding and it was all running across your face. I wanted to get a sense of what you were feeling, how many different things were going on in your mind and heart at the same time.
I love that shot so much.
Yeah.
And I think, honestly, the first thought was I hadn't played through the possibility that there would be a voicemail and had no plan for what to say, like whether I should say something because it's such an intimate first contact. To hear her voice was something that I had been wanting, my whole life. And having a daughter myself at that point, knowing that like hearing the sound of my child's voice would be really big. And the message, like having it be a recording and not live, felt weird. So there was that. And also just like, what do I say? And so that was one of them. And then also hearing her voice for the first time was her voicemail, was just her outgoing, like, hey, this is April, leave a message. So hearing the sound of her voice, it made her real in a different way. I mean, every little bit of information that I had about her, because it was a closed adoption. So when we first encountered each other, it was with letters, handwritten letters, and seeing her handwriting, I pored over her handwriting and the syntax, the way that she used words, and made a lot of assumptions, guesses, like filled in as much as I could with the way she held a pen. And then hearing the voicemail was also like just fleshing her out.
Sure.
So the feelings were simultaneously just goofy, I'm not ready for this. And also,
Yeah, and I like when you're critiquing yourself after you've
Yeah.
hung up from the
that was a terrible voicemail. I like the sound of your voice is a weird thing to say. Yeah.
But there's the extra layer too that you're being filmed on top of all of that just personal processing of emotions. You've also got a camera on you as well.
True. It's true. I mean, I feel like because I'm an actor, I'm a little bit more comfortable in front of cameras than some other people. But there were definitely moments of being like, this is like, we're going to be able to hear my stupid voicemail again and again forever.
Well, so being an actor, the two, like, did you feel like a need to be performative in that scene, or just like emotions kind of just took over?
Yeah, no, I felt so grateful. I think because of the small amount of film work that I had done up to that point, the amount of time that I spend in front of a camera when I'm doing scripted material, and then the amount of time that actually gets into the film is so small that when we were making a documentary, I was like, there's no chance most of these seconds are going to be in the final cut.
Oh, good point.
So I just sort of chose to assume that everything, I knew the moment we first physically met that would make it in, and everything else, I was like, I have no idea, how much of this is actually going to be seen. So I didn't feel much pressure to be performative.
It didn't come across that way. I was curious as you were processing all the emotions, but yeah.
Good question.
Brooke, I wanted to start off with the documentary's title as well, which I kind of had assumptions with the knowing the name of it, then clicking play and seeing the film. But it also, there's like kind of once you see the film, there's a very haunting backstory to it as well. So could you kind of explain who the Lost Bird is, and then how you come up with the title as well?
Actually, not a lot of people have asked us this question. Lost birds in general kind of refer to this whole generation of people from the Indian Adoption Project who were disconnected from their families. And it also kind of refers to, people who have gone into foster care as well, that just being disconnected and, families knowing that they're out there, but, not able to kind of bring them back in. And Lost Bird, and this is actually a really poignant and important story, and you could do a full documentary on her life, is an actual person. And she was born sometime in 1890 and was a survivor of the Wounded Knee massacre. She was discovered kind of being protected by her mother, who had found like a shelter and like curled up and, had protected this baby. And a bunch of like the, military muckety mucks found her. And then this one General Leonard Colby, he adopted her and brought her back in, with his family with the intent of raising her as a white woman. And that's where her name comes from when she did, go back, to be with her Lakota people. They gave her this name, and I'm probably saying it incorrectly, but it's Sinkala Nuni, which means lost bird. And so, she had a tremendously tragic life where she was abused, like some scholars dispute that she was abused by her adoptive father, but there are some sources that she was sexually abused by him. And later, she, because she was kind of straddling these worlds, she ended up in this kind of vaudeville, Wild West show situation where she worked on that show and, had relationships with some of the performers. And anyway, her story, she ended up getting syphilis, and the end of her life was incredibly tragic. And all of it is, stemming from this disconnection to her culture and not really being accepted in either place. And it's a huge tragedy, and, her memory should be honored.
And I would imagine that story gets told again and again as you explore the fallout from the program that you've mentioned a couple of times, the 1958 Indian Adoption Act. I wanted to have some more details about what the government explained. I mean, what did they see as the purpose of it, and what were some of the actual consequences?
Well, the Indian Adoption Project was all part of, this broad tactic of, taking Native people and removing them from their culture, and all of it is about, not honoring the treaties, not not honoring and respecting people as people, and this very paternalistic view that, this white way of doing things is, the better way, and ignoring, the thousands of years of civilizations that the, like hundreds, over 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States, for example, all of that like depth of cultural knowledge, and, that was somehow invalidated by this, colonizing force. So, it's not just like, you don't want to just like look at it in this one piece. You have to see the whole of the tactic of assimilation that was happening, with the boarding schools that happened, where it was the, the idea of kill the Indian, save the man, with, with this adoption project, with, the relocation efforts in the 50s, which also included, for Cleveland specifically, was a relocation city where they would have, Native people from different tribes around the country, like, they'd be like, here, we'll give you some money to move to these cities so that you can work. But, the jobs, of course, are not, they're not lucrative. They're not, about like rising in this American dream. It's like being a part, more of blue collar technical work that might not necessarily, help you once you've moved to these big cities. So that's kind of all a part of this, era of like the 50s, where it's like, well, there's still this Indian problem. Like, here are some of the ways that we can deal with it. I mean, there in the 70s, women were being forcibly sterilized by, the government too. So it's not like just like one isolated incident of things. There's a lot of pretty shameful history that, we're all still grappling with as Indigenous people.
Kendra, I wanted to switch back over to your experience. How early in your life did you know that you were adopted?
The day that I came home from the hospital, I was 3 days old, and my mom and dad told me a bedtime story that they came up with off the cuff about a man and a woman who loved each other and wanted to share that love with another person, but were unable to make a child, and that God had brought me to them. And the story was told to me through my whole life. So I never didn't know. I always knew that I was adopted, and love and gratitude for the choice that April made was always included in the telling of the story, that she selected my parents and put me up for adoption, willingly.
Sure.
So then it sounds like you always knew who your birth mother was then?
No, so it was a closed adoption, but the agency had given, as I understand it, it was like she saw sheets of information about different couples, and she had some criteria that was important to her. Okay. And my parents met that criteria, and they had very vague information about who she was. So yeah, it was definitely not open. I did not know her. I just knew that it was a choice that she had made. Yeah.
I guess I was also curious at what point ethnicity came in.
Yeah.
Did they tell you?
Much later.
Okay.
Much later. Yeah. They didn't tell me that I was Native because they didn't know for sure. April was adopted she was adopted also at birth, and her birth mother it wasn't put into the adoption records that she was Native. There was no tribal affiliation. She just thought she might be. So when she put me up for adoption and filled out the ethnicity, she wasn't sure what to put. And she had told the agency she thought she might be Native, but didn't know what tribe, didn't know what community, and had no proof of, like, she had not been claimed by a tribe. So this is like how I didn't technically apply for the Indian adoption for ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, because we didn't know if I was for sure or not. And I think that it was such a complicated or complex situation that my parents just didn't say anything about it until I was a teenager. And I don't remember exactly when they told me. I think it was right before I turned 18, maybe somewhere between 16 and 18, I found out.
I wanted to ask Brooke about the historical clips that are in the film, because they show the forced regimentation of Native children. How old is that footage, and where did it come from?
Sure. And this is a great question. And I had to, dig up a little bit from, our archival package when we were digging into it. So the University of South Carolina Moving Image Collection has actually quite a lot of video about Indigenous people. And so some of our footage came from that. And so there's this. So some of the children working and marching and things like that, that's actually filmed in 1926 in Arizona somewhere. And I actually don't know enough about, that footage because that was not, I wasn't like the archival researcher for that. But we also had footage from the Library of Congress also, has a great resource of footage, and the where the kids are singing 10 Little Indians or whatever it is. But that's from 1929, and they're filming on the Navajo reservation with this Bureau of Indian Affairs agent, C.L. Walker. And watching that whole thing is very fascinating because you can see, it's like propaganda about this is like our way of dealing with the Indian problem. And not to say that, boarding schools aren't a good way of teaching people, because, there are still Indigenous boarding schools, but it's more, from the cultural perspective of, forcing children to cut their hair and learn totally different languages, this hasn't
and not
been a
practice
society.
Traditions that they might have learned from birth.
Right. Yeah. Our society isn't always one of inclusion. It's sometimes one of exclusion, and exclusion to the fact of, having just kind of one monoculture has been kind of the United States' MO, especially in regards to Indigenous people. So yeah, if you dig it up, it's interesting to watch the whole thing.
So I think that's the same clip. That's where the Bureau of Indian Affairs official is talking about their quote unquote mission.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, that was just chilling to watch, kind of just jaw on the floor. I can't believe that. I mean, because it's the way it was presented too. Like you said, this is here's what we're doing. This is the way to do it. You're just holy cow.
Right. And you can tell, the person who was filming it was okay, man, you stand there and don't look at the camera and stare off in the distance and look at that tree. And we're going to say some really offensive shit. And you're just going to have to stand here and listen to it.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm swearing on the podcast.
No, you're fine.
Okay. Every time I watch it, I'm always horrified by, something that is in the footage. And then I'm just okay, well, having kids march around like little military kids. It's fascinating that that's what was going on.
Yeah. Some of that stuff, you're just I can't believe it's obviously worth watching and documenting and learning from, but also you're wow.
Yeah. And some of the other black and white stuff, comes from different sources. And of course, the color packages come from this 1974 hearing on the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is also super fascinating to watch.
Well, with we wanted to kind of ask too the attitudes that we're seeing, the chilling attitudes we're seeing in that footage, which is granted old footage, but is that still an attitude that you encounter today?
Well, I would say now that the Department of the Interior is being led by an Indigenous woman, Secretary Deb Haaland, you can't, there's no way that they would be able to, or she would be able to kind of look herself in the face to manage a department that, has been so problematic for Indigenous people for, 119 years or however long the Interior has been around. And so I know, like over time, like that attitudes have changed and, approaches and, respecting tribes have changed. To go back to your point about, recognizing Indigenous ethnicity, that's a whole other conversation to have about Indigenous people, because we're not an ethnic group. We are a political minority because of our treaty rights. We are all members of our own sovereign nations, and that's what makes us different, from other, groups in the United States. So that's something that it's like I'm always trying to bring up, because it's also a part of this challenge to the Indian Child Welfare Act at the moment, which is being done by, some very conservative groups in Texas. And their argument is that ICWA is race-based, and it's not race-based. It's based on tribes being able to determine their members, which is a part of being a sovereign nation, being able to govern yourself and, decide who your citizens are. And so the fact that they're attacking it based on this race question is a pretty insidious way of also trying to dismantle tribes, because if you're able to dismantle tribes, then you're also able to get at our land. And, they're like tribal land is about, in the United States, amounts to about the size of the state of Minnesota. That's how much disparate Indigenous land is, across the US. Of course, it was all our land to begin with, but, that's what we're dealing with now.
Well, I mean, the question about whether or not we're still experiencing, I think that Indigenous people in the United States are definitely still experiencing the ripple effects and repercussions of it's not so maybe overtly stated as the BIA was saying in the beginning, but it is absolutely still present. And I think that the amount of, in my own very steep learning curve, the amount of education that's necessary when speaking to most non-Native people about where the impressions that they get come from, and my own impressions where they, how little education most Americans have around what happened, and then you look at the way that Native people are portrayed in media, and you look at the lack of representation in any kind of storytelling for mainstream audiences. Mm-hmm. And so I think that it's very much still present. It's just subtler.
Right. And I'm glad you brought that up, Kendra, because so often our statistics are, not included in the national conversation. It's like, the percentage of white people, Black people, Hispanic, and then, we're never included in stats. And oftentimes, we have some really, really, really troubling stats, the highest suicide rates in the nation, a lot of very troubling things. And, when you're not being included in those conversations all the time, it's an effective erasure of us as people. There was already a huge genocide, and now we're still here, we've survived, but we're being ignored is not a helpful, way of being an ally for Indigenous folks.
Actually, this kind of segues into the next thing I wanted to ask you, Kendra, which is about something you say several times in the film. I don't know what it means to be Native. And that may have been earlier in the process. And when you meet April, your birth mother, she says it as well to the camera. I'm wondering if the film helped either or both of you come to terms with that question, and claim that part of your identity.
I can say that it is both murkier and more clear than it was when it began. I entered, I mean, I think the first time I said it was very early on in filming. I was still pregnant with my daughter, so it was like 8 years ago. And I felt like it was elusive, and I wanted to stand in the identity of a Native woman. But at that time, my education was my understanding of what Native, it was still a mono thing. It was like all Native people are this like capital N Native, and you can be it or you are not it. And now I understand that there is like a very wide way of being in that identity, and that it is nuanced even within families. And it's murkier because I'm still learning I mean, I think I will always be learning the nuances, but it is more clear in that I identify as a Native woman, which took I think maybe 2 years ago, Brooke, maybe I was able to say it without like cringing, like, is that okay? Can I say that? I still don't know if I can say that. And I can now. And Brooke still has to remind me that I've been claimed by my family, and I've gone back and they've welcomed me. So I can.
Yeah. Brooke, even though you grew up with the knowledge of where you came from, I was wondering what effect making this film has had on you, on your own connections to family and culture and tradition.
Yeah. So like many Indigenous people, I didn't grow up in a traditional family. I didn't grow up doing things and, with either my Blackfeet or my Salish family, which, their traditions are like, there's some similarities, but there's also huge differences, between like the two cultures. So for me, I was privileged to move back to Montana after I had, gone away for school. I went away for my undergrad, I went away for my graduate work. And when I was finishing up making the short film with Kendra in New York City, I wanted to move back to Montana to really like get some time with my family back here. And through that and through the process, like not making this film specifically, but just living back at home, I've been able to go to things that I wouldn't have been able to go to, in New York City. I mean, you don't get to, go to ceremony necessarily when you're like living in New York City, because like, who's going to run that ceremony? It's not me, because I don't know what it is. So I've been fortunate to be able to do that, with people on both sides of my family.
Well, wrapping up, Brooke, we wanted to get your kind of feelings on what it means to receive the Groundbreaker Award as a filmmaker here at the Cleveland Film Festival.
Well, I didn't really think of what to say. And I should probably do a little bit more deep thinking about this. But I'm just incredibly honored to receive this award, especially with so many worthy films that are all tackling social justice issues. So, I deeply appreciate it. I also have to recognize that Cleveland and Ohio in general is a really fascinating place to win this award, because, there's not the Indigenous community there like there are in some other cities and states. And, I'm really looking forward to meeting the Indigenous community that has remained from like, the relocation days. And, just thinking about like the way that Native people are situated, I think, in the consciousness of people in Ohio. Ohio has the highest number of Native mascots in the entire nation for high school students. And so, but I think one of like the lowest numbers of like Indigenous people populating the state. So I'm just, I just kind of want to bring like some awareness about that and how grateful I am that, I think Cleveland International Film Festival is recognizing this film and its importance in a community that, while like Indigenous people continue to be kind of set to the side or erased, that, this is like a real point for exposure and visibility. And there's a lot of power in that. So thank you.
Thank you, both of you, because I learned a lot from watching this film, and I also learned how much I don't know. So there's much more I can explore. Thank you.
Thank you.
We've been talking to Groundbreaker Award-winning filmmaker Brooke Pepion Swaney and subject Kendra Mylnechuk Potter about the documentary feature Daughter of a Lost Bird. That film screens Saturday, April 2nd at 7:40 p.m. and Sunday, April 3rd at 5:10 p.m. in the Mimi, Ohio Theater at Playhouse Square. It'll also be part of CIFF 46 Streams, which runs online from April 10th through the 17th. Find out more about all that's going on at the film festival by logging on to the website clevelandfilm.org. I'm Dee Perry.
And I'm Aaron Spears.
Thanking our sponsor for this podcast, Wayside Furniture, keeping it local since 1937. And thank you for listening to CIFF Speaks.